Hey Vue fans, welcome to another video about Vue, TypeScript, and more specifically Kitbag. My name is Evan, I'm one of the developers at Kitbag, and today I'm introducing Kitbag Router. First, an overview. When we decided we should build our own router, it was because A, it sounded challenging and we like challenges, but more so B, because we thought the developer experience of the official Vue-Router was, first and foremost, we wanted type safety. However, there are alternative ways of getting type safety without needing to start from scratch, so we had to come up with some really good ideas to justify such an endeavor. So we built a far better parameter experience, including params not just in the path, but also in the host and the query. We added built-in rejection handling, async prop fetching, and a lot of cool stuff. Kitbag Router is brand new, from scratch, attempt at routing in Vue applications, so it's not backwards compatible. It's not even really designed to make migrating super simple. This is a fresh start, a huge shift towards something that we think developers in Vue are going to love. I'll walk you through how to set up a new project in Vue using Kitbag Router. We'll go over the basics like defining routes, nesting them, and navigating between them. We're also going to dive deep into some of the more powerful features like working with params, creating custom param types, built-in rejections, and more. By the end of the series, you should have everything you need to decide if Kitbag Router is right for your next Vue project. All right. Let's create a new Vue project. We're going to use npm create Vue at latest. So we have a new Vue app. Now let's go install Kitbag Router. Before we do anything with the router, let's create a component that's going to be our homepage. So inside of a components folder, I'm going to create homepage.vue, and we'll just do something simple here. Now let's define a single route for our homepage. I'm going to create a router folder, and inside of the index, let's define our routes. And then we're going to use this create route utility from Kitbag. For name, we'll use home. And for path, let's just use a /, and then we'll connect the component to our homepage component that we just built. So with our routes defined, we can create and export now our router instance. All right, now let's go install our plugin. We'll go to main.ts, and we need to access the app. We're going to use app.use, and we can pass in our router. Additionally, we should update the registered router. We're going to declare a module at kitbag/router, and we're going to define a register interface with a single property for now called router, which is going to be assigned to the router that we just created. This is important. This updates the types inside of Kitbag Router project to ensure that you get the correct types for your routes when using Kitbag composables like UseLink and UseRoute, as well as Kitbag components like RouterLink. Last step, let's give our route component a place to be mounted. We'll do this inside of app.vue. We can clean up a lot of this file. All that really matters here is that we make sure we put a router view. All right, let's run this and see if it works. Notice that because our current location matches the path on our home route, we see our homepage component. Let's say that for this project, we're building a jobs board and we'll need some more routes. Let's add a route for viewing all the open jobs. We'll call this jobs with a path of /jobs. And I'm going to use the define async component, which comes from Vue. This is just going to allow me to use an import to delay fetching the component. And this component doesn't exist yet. We'll build that shortly. And let's do the same for a profile route, be for viewing the current user's profile. Okay, we need to make sure that we include these routes in our routes definition. Let's quickly go and create those components now. We need to create jobspage.vue and profilepage.vue. And let's see if that works. So if we go to /jobs, we see our jobs page component. And if we go to /profile, we see our profile page component. Perfect. But navigating between our routes this way is cumbersome. So let's quickly throw together a nav bar so that we can more easily navigate between these routes. We're going to just do this in app.vue. We're going to use the RouterLink from Kitbag, which has a single required property of 2. 2 accepts a relative path like /, which is what we will do here for getting back to the home page. However, because we love type safety, we're going to opt for the resolve callback. The resolve callback is going to auto-complete the available routes for us. Let's choose jobs here. And we'll do the same for profile. Because these ultimately will just render an anchor tag, we thought it was silly not to also allow for absolute URLs. Interestingly, Kitbag Router does offer a syntax for defining routes inside your router that are external, which is where the host property comes in. But we'll talk about that in a future video. For now, let's just use the string syntax and go to our docs page. I'm going to put some simple style here. And let's see how that looks. So if I open up the inspector here, we can see that we just have simple anchor tags with an href that we'd expect, as well as a utility class that is applied from Kitbag router depending on which route we're currently in. Okay, let's add another route. This time we're going to nest it under jobs. We're going to create a single job page. So inside of our router file, we're going to create a job route. The key differentiator here for a nested route is that it has this parent property, which we're going to assign to jobs. I'm going to omit the path for now because I want to use an ID param for that. We'll put together a simple component here. And we have to make sure that we include our job. Let's go to the parent jobs component now, and we'll render some links to all of our open jobs. I'm just going to use a v-for loop here. We're going to loop 10 times to just create 10 links. And we're going to navigate again using RouterLink with the resolve callback. Notice how the key here is the combination of the parent route name and the child route name combined by dot. And of course we have to include a router view again because jobs here is now a parent route and it might render children. Okay, so that more or less works, but job page isn't actually ready yet because of the ID param thing, so we need to make that not callable. Let's go into our routes file and let's comment out the name property. Routes without names still provide useful context. It can help developers understand the relationship between routes, and it also gives you the opportunity to set up specific properties like meta and state and hooks for all of its descendants without needing to create a component for it. Notice how without a name, our job route is no longer a valid destination. This includes when we navigate programmatically, which we haven't tried yet. So let's go do that. Let's take a look at router.push. For this task, we're going to create a sign up page, which will just have a simple form. When submitted, it will theoretically create a user, and it should navigate you to your profile page. So let's create that. We're just going to define a simple form here with an email field and a password field. And then inside of our setup, we need access to the current router. We're going to use UseRoute. And then let's define a create user function. Here's some boilerplate, which is where we're going to pretend that we created a user. And assuming that that's successful, we want to navigate to the profile page. So we're going to use router.push. And again, we can see TypeScript is giving us autocomplete of the available routes. We need to make sure we create this sign-in route and add it to our available routes. And then back in our browser, we can see once we complete the form, we theoretically create the user, and then we're navigated to our profile as we expected. Remember when we defined a job route? The URL for viewing a specific job is probably something like /jobs/123, where 123 is the job's ID. Let's go update our route to use that. So if we look at our router file, let's put back in the name so that we can actually call it. And then for the path, we're going to define a / and then job ID. In Kitbag router, params are defined with these square brackets. The value inside the square brackets is the name that we assign to the param, so job ID in this case. There are virtually no constraints on what you can name your param, except that each param name has to be unique. Now that our job route expects a param, TypeScript is going to require that we satisfy this requirement anywhere that we're routing to job. So if we go back to our parent jobs page, where we have all those links to open jobs, we can see that we need to satisfy this job ID requirement, which we will just use the index here, and we'll need to call toString, because index is currently a number. Now the router can create a path that fits the expected format. Let's take a look. Notice how our hrefs have the ID interpolated where we'd expect. Although in this app, job ID was supposed to be a number, so having to call toString to satisfy the router is a bit annoying. It also means that the value will probably require that we parse it back to number inside of our components. Thankfully, Kitbag router solves this for you. Let's update our route to expect a number for job ID. To do this, we're going to use the path utility, which allows us to assign different param types for the params that it sees in the path. In this case, job ID is the only param, and to tell the router that we expect a number, we're going to use the number constructor. This is a simple format that Kitbag ships with, and it allows you to support params that are string by default, Boolean, number, date, JSON, as well as regex. However, you could totally define your own custom param type. Let's check back on those router links that we have in the jobs page. Notice how TypeScript is upset with us. It expected job ID to be a number, but we still have it as strings. Remove toString, and now it's happy. This is obviously super convenient, but it also means that the router sees something like /jobs/ABC and will result in not found, since it doesn't satisfy the constraints that you defined for that route. Next, let's look at how we can access the param from within our job page. Let's use the UseRoute Composable to access the current route. This composition takes an optional key argument to automatically narrow the return type for you. In this case, we know that we're inside of jobs.job. Because we narrowed our route, TypeScript knows what params we have, and it knows that job ID is a number. Notice how when I navigate to different jobs, the ID param at runtime is what we'd expect. While in this example, we didn't really need to update the value for the param, it's worth noting here that params themselves are writable. So if you changed the value of job ID, the router would automatically update the URL for you. If you ever want to debounce this or update multiple parameters at once, you can also do this with the update method on the route. There's a lot more you can do with params, including making them optional, as well as using them in places other than the path. Let's do both of these with a new sort param on the query. We're going to do this on the jobs page. Since the jobs page shows a list of jobs, we might want to support sorting that. And we're going to store that in the query. The syntax for this is like any query string. It's name of the query param equals value. If there were multiple, they'd be combined with an ampersand. Notice the syntax for query here is to use foo equals value and bar equals value. The order is not important. Values can be static or using the param square brackets if you want to. Let's take a look at the types. Notice how our link is broken because it's expecting sort now. However, we wanted sort to be optional. Let's go fix that. All we have to do is add a question mark inside of our square brackets. So notice our link is happy again, but if we wanted to, we still could supply a sort. This sort param is a great opportunity to demonstrate a custom type. I think it'd be super cool if our sort param was something like the property that's being sorted and then a colon and the direction that it's being sorted. So something like posting date colon descending. Let's create a custom param that enforces this. Inside of the router folder, I'm going to create a new file called sortparam.ts. And this is where I'm going to encapsulate all of the logic for our types, for expected key and expected sort. And then we're going to create this sort type, which is just the combination of the expected key, colon, and direction. We're going to use all of this to create our sort param. To create a custom param, we can use the create param utility from Kitbag Router. For arguments, we're given the value, which is always going to be a string, as well as an invalidate method. We should be able to expect our string to be split by a colon. If the key or direction aren't correct, we'll throw invalid. This will help Kitbag Router know that this URL is not valid for this route. And if we got this far, we know that it is a valid sort and we can just return it. We use this param just like we did all of the built-in types. Just like path, Kitbag also offers a query utility, which will let me change param types for any params that it finds in the query. Here we'll assign sort to our sort param. With this custom parameter in place, we have several valid query strings now for jobs. We could just have jobs. We could have /jobs ? Sort, which would result in sort being undefined. And we could have distance descending, things like this. This particular format for a simple string param also lends itself nicely to Kitbag Router's built-in regex type. Just for fun, I'll show you what that would look like. We can go ahead and define our regex pattern right in line here. And with this, Kitbag Router is going to do all of the same logic for us to make sure that a given URL matches the format that we expect. The only downside of using regex here over the other type is that when we access the value, it'll just be string again, versus using our custom type, TypeScript will actually be able to tell us that it is this sort type that we defined earlier. The regex param is a particularly powerful way of expressing a dynamic part of your route and then using regular regex to tell Router how to validate it. In case you missed it, and in case it's not obvious, when your param is optional, that means that your component might receive a value of undefined for that param. You might be tempted to handle this with the nullish coalescing in your component, like in jobspage.view, we can access the route using UseRoute, and we're going to narrow it to the jobs parent. And then if we defined a computed here, we could use nullish coalescing to say, if there isn't a params.sort, let's go ahead and use our default sort of posting date descending. Alternatively, you can use the with default utility from Kitbag Router. If we head back to our router file, any param can be wrapped with default, which then we simply provide a value that satisfies the type. Now with this default, our type for sort inside of our route params is correctly just sort. We no longer need this nullish coalescing. Remember that profile route we added? We don't know for sure that we actually have a user logged in. So we should probably set up some safeguards around that profile route to make sure that someone's logged in. Let's solve this problem with hooks, different lifestyle hooks from Kitbag Router that we could use. There are also 3 different levels. There are global hooks, which are defined on the router itself and apply to all routes. There are route hooks, which are defined on the route itself. And then there are component hooks, which are defined in the component with the help of the composition API. For this use case, let's use the onBeforeRouteEnter hook, and we're going to define that on the route itself. But first, let's quickly create an imaginary layer responsible for knowing if there is an active user. We're going to drop this in the services folder, and we'll just call it activeuser.ts. Let's define a type for our user, which is just going to be a simple ID. And we're just going to store a ref for current user, which will be user, but it will default to undefined, which we're going to treat as meaning there are no current users. So if we look at our profile route, here we can add our hook, which is given to and context. If we look at context more, there's lots of properties here that we can use. Let's start off with using the abort syntax. Abort is specifically only available for these before hooks, and when called, it will basically just ensure that the router does not continue with the route change. Alternatively, we could have used the push function inside of the context and always redirected to home maybe. So if there is no active user, we'll use push. Maybe doesn't work quite as nicely, but still a valid use case. Another solution would be to utilize rejections. Rejections are a special state that the router uses to override default behavior. If a rejection happens at any point in the router lifecycle, it will replace whatever current route and component would normally be set with a special route and a special component associated with the rejection. Kitbag Router ships with a rejection built in for not found. The router uses this rejection internally to handle situations where the URL doesn't match any of your route definitions. So if we go back to the application and we put in a URL that we know doesn't match any of our routes, we get an example here of what happens on not found. We can also add our own custom rejections by simply extending that register interface again. Let's go into main.ts where we overrode the router property. Let's also override the rejections to include auth needed. And with that, we can now trigger auth needed rejection in our route hook. Let's go do that. If we look at our router file, we can now use the reject from context and say auth needed. And there we have it. We have a custom rejection. For situations like auth needed, it probably makes more sense to send the user back to a login view. So let's build a placeholder for a login page. For now, let's just steal the same form from the signup page. Except instead of create user, we are going to create a method called attempt login, which we don't actually need to implement. So when we create our router instance, we can override the default component for any rejection. For auth needed, let's say that we need to go to the login view. So if we trigger this rejection again, we see that now we see our login page. Note how we've mounted this login page without overriding the URL. This means that when the user is authenticated, we can simply ask the router to refresh and the user is right where they left off. Let's have our attempt login just work every time. And we'll call router refresh. Before I demo this, let's update the profile page to actually show who's logged in. If we go to profilepage.view, let's add a header here for activeuser.id. And now notice how after having triggered a rejection, I can try logging in. The router will automatically refresh for us, and we'll now see user42 is logged in. We think that lifecycle hooks and specifically rejections make it easier than ever to ensure that your router is robust without being difficult to understand or maintain. Okay, that's it for this introduction to Kitbag Router. Over the course of this series, we covered all of the fundamentals that you should need to decide if Kitbag Router is right for your next Vue project. Everything I covered in this series is explained probably more eloquently in our docs, which I'll link below. Follow me on Medium, where I dive deep into new features being added to Kitbag Router. Join us in Discord, help us decide what we should be prioritizing next. If you liked this video, if you like Kitbag Router, please go to GitHub, please give us a star. Help us to get this in front of more Vue developers. Until next time, happy coding.